Imagine waking up one morning to find your own land under attack. Not by burglars, not by the government, but by the one person every neighborhood dreads, the HOA Karen. She wasn't just any nosy neighbor. She was a self-appointed suburban dictator, armed with a clipboard, a superiority complex, and an unhealthy obsession with controlling everything. Even land that wasn't hers. At first, it was just petty complaints. Then fake violation notices. Then, she went too far, trespassing, calling the police on me, and even trying to force me to sell my own property. But what she didn't realize, she picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. What happened next? Let's just say, karma had a clipboard of its own. Buckle up, because this is the HOA showdown you won't believe. Hello, beautiful people. Before we dive in, a small click from you can help us for subscribers. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the journey. Let's go. It was a quiet morning in the neighborhood. The kind where you could hear birds chirping, a distant lawnmower humming, and the occasional dog barking at a squirrel. My little slice of suburban paradise. I had my coffee in one hand, newspaper in the other, and not a single care in the world. Until she appeared. Karen, the self-appointed queen of our HOA. She didn't have an official title, but if you asked her, she practically ran the place. Armed with her ever-present clipboard, a permanent scowl, and a sharp eye for even the most trivial infractions, she had a special talent for making everyone's life just a little bit harder. She strutted down the street like a mall cop on a power trip, stopping in front of my yard with a look of pure disapproval. I didn't even have to turn around to know what was coming. I sighed. "Morning, Karen." She pursed her lips, adjusting her oversized sunglasses as if preparing for a dramatic speech. I noticed something concerning. Here we go. I followed her gaze, trying to spot whatever ridiculous issue she'd managed to cook up this time. My mailbox? No, it was fine. The grass? Recently mowed. No rogue trash bins, no holiday lights out of season. She tapped her clipboard. Your property. I don't know if you're aware, but it's rather unsightly. I blinked. Unsightly? She nodded, completely serious. It's undeveloped. Just sitting there. It's bringing down the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Ah, so that was it. Unlike the neat rows of identical houses that made up our HOA-controlled paradise, my lot was a bit of an anomaly. I owned a nice chunk of land next to my house. Nothing crazy, but big enough to stand out. It was mostly empty, a few trees, some wildflowers, and a general air of freedom that clearly offended Karen's deeply ingrained sense of order. I like it that way, I said simply. And it's my land. Karen gave me a thin smile, the kind that made you brace for impact. Well, several of us feel that it would be better suited for development. Maybe another home. Or a community space. Several of you? I raised an eyebrow. Or just you? She gasped, clutching her clipboard like I had personally insulted her ancestors. I am speaking on behalf of the community. Sure you are. Look, Karen, I appreciate the concern, I said, trying to keep my tone civil. But I'm not selling. And I'm definitely not developing it just to match the rest of the neighborhood. Her lips tightened, and for a brief moment, I saw something flash in her eyes. A mix of disbelief and barely restrained outrage. Karen wasn't used to people telling her no. Well, she sniffed, that's unfortunate. I suppose I'll have to bring this up with the HOA board. I sighed again. You do that. With a huff, she spun on her heel and marched away, already scribbling something in her clipboard, as if documenting my very existence was an offense worthy of review. I should have known that wasn't the end of it. Because Karen never let things go. A few days passed without incident. For a brief, fleeting moment, I let myself believe that Karen had given up on her crusade against my perfectly legal, perfectly fine plot of land. Maybe she had found a new neighbor to terrorize. Maybe she had exhausted herself from sheer entitlement. I should have known better. It started subtly at first. A passive-aggressive note tucked under my door, printed in a font so proper and formal it could have been an HOA-issued warrant. Asterisk, dear homeowner. It has come to the attention of the Homeowners Association that your unused land is negatively impacting the visual harmony of the neighborhood. We strongly encourage you to consider improvements that will align with the community aesthetic. Failure to do so may result in further action. Asterisk. There was no signature. No official HOA seal. Just an ominous warning written in what I could only assume was the Karen font. Times New Roman, size 12, with just the right amount of condescension. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash. That should have been the end of it. But Karen wasn't just any ordinary HOA busybody. She was persistent. A one-woman army with a clipboard, a bad attitude, and far too much time on her hands. The next day, I caught her standing in front of my land, hands on her hips, muttering something under her breath. When she noticed me watching, she snapped into action, whipping out a tape measure like a detective at a crime scene. "Morning, Karen," I called. "Taking up a new hobby?" She barely spared me a glance. "Just ensuring everything is up to code." "Up to code?" I repeated, amused. "You do realize I haven't built anything, right?" "That's the problem." I blinked. "What?" She straightened, crossing her arms. "Empty lots are an eyesore. Unused space is wasted space. And as a responsible HOA member, I have a duty to ensure that our property values remain intact." Ah, so that was her angle. I leaned against my fence, arms folded. "Let me guess. You want me to sell it?" Her eyes practically sparkled. "Well, it just so happens that there's been interest in the land. A buyer who would be willing to." "Not interested." Karen's smile faltered. "You haven't even heard the offer." "I don't need to." She huffed. "You're being difficult." I shrugged. "And you're being nosy." For a moment, we just stared at each other in the standoff of the century. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she turned and marched off, dialing something on her phone as she went. I figured she was venting to a friend, maybe calling a fellow HOA enforcer to commiserate about that one neighbor who just won't fall in line. I wasn't even close. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange violation notice slapped onto my mailbox. Infraction: failure to maintain property to HOA standards. Immediate action required. Now, I wasn't an HOA expert, but I was fairly certain that owning land wasn't an infraction. Karen, however, had taken it upon herself to rewrite reality. I sighed, grabbed the notice, and walked over to my favorite neighbor's house, Tom. Tom was one of the few sane people on the block, and as luck would have it, he actually was on the HOA board. When he answered the door, he took one look at the notice in my hand and groaned. "Karen." "Bingo." He motioned for me to come inside, already rubbing his temples like he was preparing for a headache. "What is it this time?" "She's trying to find me for existing, apparently." Tom read over the notice, his frown deepening. "This isn't even a real violation. She can't just make up rules." "She sure thinks she can." Tom let out a long-suffering sigh. "I'll talk to the board. But you know how Karen is. She'll just find another angle." He wasn't wrong. By the end of the week, I had received another violation notice, this time for neglecting landscaping duties, on a piece of land that was literally just nature existing. A written request, more like demand, to consider the community's best interest and sell my land to an undisclosed buyer. A surprise visit from an actual HOA inspector, who took one look at my property and told me I wasn't breaking any rules, much to Karen's dismay. That should have been the moment she gave up. But Karen was just getting started. One afternoon, I spotted her standing on my lot again, clipboard in hand, this time with a small group of HOA loyalists in tow. They murmured amongst themselves, occasionally glancing my way as if I were some kind of neighborhood menace. Finally, Karen turned and addressed me like a queen addressing a lowly peasant. "We've had a meeting. How nice for you. We've decided that your land would be better suited as a community garden." I stared. "Excuse me?" "It would be a donation to the neighborhood," she continued, beaming like she'd just solved world hunger. "Think of the possibilities. Flowers, benches, a space for people to gather. You want me to give away my land?" "Well, not give away," she hedged. "Just transfer ownership to the HOA for proper management." I let out a short laugh. "Absolutely not." Karen's face twitched. "But it would benefit the community." "You mean it would benefit you?" The murmuring behind her grew quieter. Even some of her followers seemed to realize how ridiculous she sounded. Karen squared her shoulders. "I will be taking this to the board." "You do that?" I figured that was the end of it. But no, Karen, in all her unhinged glory, went one step further. A few days later, I heard sirens. Stepping outside, I was greeted by the sight of 2 police officers standing in front of my home. And there, standing smugly beside them, was Karen. She folded her arms, practically vibrating with satisfaction. "I've reported an illegal land use issue." I blinked. "What?" The officer sighed, clearly already exhausted. "She's claiming your land is abandoned and needs to be seized for community purposes." For a moment, I was speechless. Then, finally, I managed. "You called the cops because I refused to sell my property?" Karen lifted her chin. "I tried to resolve this civilly." The officer turned to me. Sir, do you have documentation proving ownership of the land? I let out a sharp laugh. Oh, you mean like the deed to my own property? Karen's expression faltered slightly. I shook my head and turned back to the officers. Give me 2 minutes. Marching inside, I grabbed my documents, the very same ones I had already shown Karen multiple times. When I handed them to the officers, they barely glanced at them before giving Karen a look that screamed, Lady, are you serious? One of them sighed. Ma'am, this is clearly private property. There's no issue here. Karen's face went red. But, if you continue to harass this homeowner, you could be facing legal consequences. I swear I heard a record scratch. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For the first time, she had no response. And I had never felt so victorious. After the cops left, Karen stood there, stunned, like her entire worldview had just crumbled. For someone who had spent so much time bending rules to her advantage, actually facing consequences had clearly never been part of her plan. She opened her mouth as if to argue with the officers. Maybe try one last desperate attempt at convincing them I was some kind of suburban criminal. But then she must have realized that pushing her luck wasn't in her best interest. Instead, she huffed, spun on her heel, and stormed off without another word. I stood in my driveway, watching her retreat, shaking my head in disbelief. That should have been the end of it. But Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. No, she was regrouping, recalculating, and most likely, plotting her next ridiculous move. I figured if she wasn't going to give up, I might as well start having a little fun. The first step? Playing the game better than she did. Since Karen loved to weaponize the HOA rules, I decided it was time to remind her that she wasn't the only one who could read a rulebook. That night, I sat down with a fresh cup of coffee, pulled up the HOA bylaws, and started combing through them. If she wanted to keep pushing nonsense violations my way, I wanted to be prepared. And what I found? Oh, it was beautiful. The rules, as it turned out, were very specific. And as much as Karen thought she was above them, she wasn't. For example, she had reported me for neglecting landscaping duties on my land, but according to HOA guidelines, the only thing required of undeveloped property owners was ensuring no hazardous debris or obstructions blocked sidewalks, which meant she had 0 grounds to stand on. Even better, I found multiple violations that Karen herself was guilty of. Her own yard had a fence 2 inches higher than the HOA regulations allowed. She had decorative garden lights that weren't HOA approved. And best of all, her mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. Oh, the irony. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. While sipping my coffee on the porch, I saw Karen on her usual patrol, scanning the neighborhood for imaginary crimes. She glanced in my direction, nose in the air, still clearly bitter about her failed police stunt. I smiled and called out, "Morning, Karen. Lovely day, isn't it?" She stiffened. Humph. Oh, she was salty. I waited for her to walk past my driveway, then casually added, "By the way, you might want to double-check your mailbox color. I was reviewing the HOA guidelines last night, and, well, rules are rules, right?" The way she froze in place was priceless. I could almost see the gears turning in her head as she processed what I'd just said. Slowly, she turned to look at me, her expression unreadable. "My mailbox," she echoed. I nodded innocently. "Yeah, I noticed it's not quite the right shade of approved neutral. Just wouldn't want you getting a violation notice. You know how these things go." Her jaw clenched. "I'm on the HOA board." I sipped my coffee. "And I'm sure you hold yourself to the same high standards as everyone else." For the first time since I'd lived here, Karen was speechless. I gave her one last smile and went inside, shutting the door before she could sputter out a response. That was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I made it my mission to be the most perfect homeowner possible. I measured my grass height to precisely meet HOA regulations. I ensured my trash bins were taken and the second collection was done. I even repainted my mailbox, just to rub it in. And Karen? She was seething. I could tell she wanted to find something, anything, to nail me for, but she was coming up empty. She'd strut past my house, clipboard in hand, scowling as she desperately tried to find a reason to file another complaint. Then the real fun began. Since Karen had tried to turn the HOA against me, I figured I'd flip the script. I started casually chatting with other neighbors, Tom, old Mrs. Henderson, even the guy 3 doors down who never spoke to anyone. And the stories? Oh, they flowed. Turns out, I wasn't the only one Karen had terrorized. She had complained about someone's flower pots being too bright. She had reported a family for having their garage door open too long. She had even accused another neighbor's dog of being an unauthorized breed. Whatever that meant. Little by little, I started to plant the seeds of dissent. Well, I'd say casually, I heard she's been reporting everyone lately. Wonder what she'll go after next. I swear, if she files one more bogus complaint. I don't even think she knows half the rules she's enforcing. Before long, the tide began to turn. Neighbors who had once feared Karen started rolling their eyes at her antics. Some even started filing their own complaints against her. One day, as I was mowing my lawn, Tom strolled up to me, smirking. You really got her riled up, you know that? I shrugged innocently. Who, me? He chuckled. She actually went to the HOA president about you last night. Oh, I leaned against the mower. And, Tom grinned. Let's just say, it didn't go the way she wanted. Apparently, Karen had barged into a meeting, binder in hand, ranting about how I was disrupting the neighborhood's harmony by not selling my own land. The HOA president, who up until now had tolerated her nonsense, had finally had enough. She was told point blank, Tom said, "You can't force someone to sell their property, Karen." I nearly dropped the mower laughing. But the best part? A few days later, Karen received her own violation notice. For what, you ask? Her mailbox color. Sweet, sweet karma. The fallout from Karen's mailbox violation was nothing short of spectacular. For someone who had built her entire identity around enforcing HOA rules, getting caught breaking them herself was like a Greek tragedy in the making. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than a leaf blower in autumn. It started with whispers. I heard she got a violation notice, Tom told me, barely containing his grin as we chatted over the fence. Mrs. Henderson, the sweet old lady who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, leaned in conspiratorially. Oh, it's true, dear. And you should have seen her face when she got it. She chuckled, sipping her iced tea. I thought she was going to faint right there on her lawn. And just like that, the power dynamic began to shift. Karen wasn't the HOA's untouchable queen anymore. She was just another homeowner caught breaking the same rules she had spent years shoving down everyone's throat. But that was only the beginning. Because as much as Karen wanted to pretend everything was fine, the cracks in her control were starting to show. The neighbors, emboldened by the fact that Karen was not above the law, started pushing back. First, it was little things. Tom left his trash bins out an extra hour just to see if she'd say something. She did, of course, but instead of cowering, he just smiled and said, "Shouldn't you be worried about your own violations, Karen?" Mrs. Henderson, who had previously been too scared to put out her garden gnome collection, lined her walkway with them, just to spite Karen. Even the quiet couple down the street, who had never so much as made a peep about HOA nonsense, started decorating their porch with the brightest, most obnoxious wind chimes they could find. And what did Karen do? Oh, she tried to fight back. She wrote more violation notices. She tried to report everyone. She even showed up at an HOA meeting with a new binder, this one bigger and more dramatic than the last. She called it her neighborhood code enforcement log. Tom told me later, laughing into his drink. I swear, I thought the HOA president was going to have an aneurysm. Apparently, Karen had compiled an entire dossier of infractions committed by her neighbors. Every minor thing she could possibly nitpick. An unmowed lawn here. A parked car slightly over the curb there. She even took time-stamped photos of someone's recycling bin being out too early. And what did the HOA do? They shut her down. Publicly. Karen, the HOA president sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. These are not real violations. But, this is harassment. Karen's face had reportedly turned beet red. I'm just trying to uphold the rules. No, the president said flatly. You're trying to run the neighborhood like a dictatorship. And quite frankly, we're all tired of it. And just like that, the iron grip she had on the community snapped. The next day, a new wave of rebellion swept through the neighborhood. Someone, no one admitted to it, but I had my suspicions, printed out copies of Karen's own violation notice and taped them to streetlights, bulletin boards, and even the neighborhood dog park. Someone else turned her mailbox violation into a meme and shared it in the local neighborhood Facebook group. By the end of the week, Karen had officially lost whatever authority she thought she had. She still stormed through the streets, still carrying her clipboard, but now? No one cared. People openly ignored her. Neighbors who once cowered under her judgment now laughed in her face. At one point, I watched as a neighbor literally mowed their lawn while making direct eye contact with her, as if daring her to complain. And me? I was enjoying every second of it. One afternoon, as I was watering my front yard, Tom came over with a smirk. "She's losing it." I raised an eyebrow. "More than usual?" "She tried to report me for having a bird feeder in my yard." I nearly choked on my water. "A bird feeder?" Tom nodded, grinning. "Apparently, it attracts wildlife in a way that disrupts the uniformity of the neighborhood." I wheezed. "So now birds are a violation?" "According to Karen, yes." The best part? The HOA dismissed her complaint outright. Her own board, the one she had ruled with an iron fist, stopped taking her seriously. She was unraveling. One day, I caught her standing in front of my land again, arms crossed, glaring like she could set it on fire with pure willpower. "You think you've won," she muttered when she saw me. I shrugged. "I think I just existed, and you lost your mind all on your own." Her nostrils flared. "This isn't over." I took a sip of my coffee, unfazed. "Whatever you say, Karen." But deep down, we both knew the truth. She had already lost. Karen wasn't one to accept defeat gracefully. In fact, if her entire personality was anything to go by, she was the type to double down when backed into a corner, no matter how ridiculous or self-destructive it was. And true to form, after the HOA shut down her complaints and the neighborhood collectively stopped taking her seriously, she escalated. Big time. It started with a last-ditch power move. One afternoon, I noticed a car parked in front of my property, a sleek, black SUV that practically screamed I'm important. Standing next to it was Karen, along with a man in an expensive-looking suit. The two of them engaged in what seemed to be a very serious discussion. Curious, I wandered outside, coffee in hand. Karen turned to me with that signature smirk, the one that usually meant she thought she had the upper hand. "Ah, good afternoon," she said, voice dripping with fake politeness. "I was just discussing a rather exciting opportunity regarding your land." I sipped my coffee. "Oh, do tell." The suited man stepped forward, adjusting his tie. "I represent a development firm that is very interested in purchasing this lot," he said smoothly. "We believe it would be an excellent location for a new property, perhaps even townhomes to better integrate with the surrounding neighborhood." Ah, so that was her play. Karen, realizing she couldn't force me to sell, had found someone with money to throw at me. I smirked. "And how much are we talking?" The man perked up. "We'd be willing to offer a very competitive rate. In fact, we can offer." I cut him off. "Let me stop you right there." He blinked. Karen folded her arms, narrowing her eyes. "Surely you'll at least hear him out." "Nope." I took another sip. "Not selling." The man's professional facade wavered slightly. "But, you haven't even heard the offer." "Doesn't matter." I gestured at my property. "I like my land just the way it is." Karen scoffed. "That's absurd. A development would benefit everyone. Except me." The man, clearly not used to being dismissed so quickly, fumbled for words. "But surely you must have some price." I shook my head. "Nope. And to be honest, if I did sell, the last thing I'd do is let Karen benefit from it." Karen's smirk finally disappeared. The man cleared his throat. "Well, should you change your mind, here's my card." He handed it to me, still looking baffled, then got back in his SUV and drove off, leaving Karen standing there, fuming. "You're making a mistake," she snapped. "No, you are," I shot back. "Because you just proved that this was never about community improvements. It's about control." She turned red. "That's not true. Then why are you this mad that I said no?" For the first time, she had no response. She just turned and stomped off, her clipboard tucked under her arm like it was a lifeline. I should have known she wasn't done. A few days later, she tried something even crazier. Karen commits trespassing. It was a quiet morning. Peaceful. Too peaceful. And in my experience, peace only meant one thing. Karen was up to something. Sure enough, when I stepped outside to grab my mail, I saw her. On my land, measuring my grass, with a literal ruler. I stopped dead in my tracks, blinking. "You've got to be kidding me." She didn't even look embarrassed. Instead, she straightened up, glaring at me. "Your lawn is exactly 1 inch over regulation height." I stared at her. "You are aware that you're trespassing, right?" She scoffed. "This is an HOA matter." "No, this is a police matter," I corrected, pulling out my phone. "Which I'd be more than happy to call them about." Her confidence flickered for just a second. "You wouldn't." I smirked. "Try me." For the first time, Karen hesitated. She knew she had crossed a line. And she also knew that if the police showed up this time, they wouldn't be on her side. With a huff, she shoved her ruler back into her bag and stomped away, muttering something about property values. That should have been the end of it. But no. Karen, in her infinite wisdom, had one final trick up her sleeve. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread about Karen's antics, the fake complaints, the violation notices, the trespassing. And the neighbors? They were done. By the time I arrived, people were already whispering, shaking their heads. Even the HOA board members looked exhausted. Karen, however, sat smugly at the front, arms crossed, as if she expected to walk away victorious. Big mistake. The meeting started with the usual formalities, but things got interesting when the president finally sighed and said, "All right, let's address the ongoing issue regarding Karen." A wave of murmurs spread through the room. Karen bristled. "Excuse me?" The HOA president, normally a mild-mannered guy, rubbed his temples. "We have received an overwhelming number of complaints regarding your behavior." Karen gasped, looking around as if she was the victim. "My behavior? I've only been doing what's best for the neighborhood." "By trying to force someone to sell their property?" The president shot back. "By calling the police over imaginary violations? By trespassing on private property?" The murmurs turned into outright agreement. Even Karen's former supporters weren't coming to her defense. "I don't want to live in a neighborhood run by a dictator," someone muttered. "She's made all our lives miserable." Karen, for the first time, looked nervous. "But I was just trying to enforce the rules." The HOA president folded his arms. "Karen, we checked." He flipped open a binder, a real one, not Karen's fantasy violation book. "And you know what we found? You've been falsely reporting violations, harassing homeowners, and misrepresenting HOA policies." Karen paled. You're being removed from the HOA board," the president cut in. "Effective immediately." The room erupted in applause. Karen? She sat there in stunned silence. For the first time, she had no power. No authority. No clipboard to hide behind. She stammered, You can't. It's already done." The president slammed the binder shut. Meeting adjourned. And just like that, Karen was dethroned. Karen didn't leave quietly. For the next few weeks, she sulked around the neighborhood, still trying to act like she was in charge. But it wasn't the same. No one took her seriously. Neighbors she once terrified openly ignored her. People openly defied her nitpicking. She was just another homeowner now, one who had burned every bridge possible. And me? I kept my land. I kept my peace. And Karen? She finally stopped bothering me. Because without her HOA power trip, she was just another person with a clipboard. And no one left to listen. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No more ridiculous violation notices. No more dramatic HOA meetings with Karen clutching her clipboard like a weapon of war. No more surprise complaints about non-existent infractions. Karen had been officially removed from the HOA board, stripped of her authority, and left to wander the streets as just another regular homeowner. Except, unlike the rest of us, nobody liked her anymore. The shift was immediate. People who once tolerated her nonsense now treated her like an afterthought. Neighbors who used to cower when she walked by stopped caring. Some of them even started pushing their luck, decorating their lawns with gnomes, bird feeders, and slightly off-white mailboxes just to rub it in. Even the HOA, which had previously let Karen run wild, completely ignored her. And the best part? Karen, for the first time in her life, was now on the receiving end of her own ridiculous standards. A few weeks after her dramatic removal, I was sitting on my porch, enjoying my coffee, when I saw her. Standing in front of her house, arms crossed, staring at a violation notice taped to her own front door. I nearly spit out my drink. Curious, I strolled over just as she ripped the paper off and read it, her face shifting from confusion to horror. "What's wrong, Karen?" I asked, feigning innocence. She turned, seething. "This is absurd." I took the notice from her hands and read it aloud. Violation, non-compliant fence height. Your fence exceeds the approved HOA regulations by 2 inches. Immediate corrective action is required within 30 days. Oh, this was too good. I barely contained my laughter. Looks like you're in violation of your own precious rules. Her face turned an impressive shade of red. That's ridiculous. My fence has been like this for years. I shrugged. So has my empty lot, but that didn't stop you from harassing me over it. She sputtered. This is different. Is it though? The best part? She had no one to argue with. Before, she would have marched straight to the HOA meeting, clipboard in hand, demanding justice. But now, nobody cared. She was just another rule breaker now. And it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, Karen received violation after violation. Her garden lights? Not HOA approved. Her mailbox? Still the wrong shade of beige. Her trash bins? Left out for a few hours too long. Instant violation. Every petty little rule she had once weaponized against the neighborhood was now being used against her. She tried to fight it. Of course she did. She showed up at an HOA meeting demanding they reverse these bogus violations. The HOA president barely looked up when he responded. "We're just enforcing the rules," he said, mimicking the same tone Karen had used against us for years. She had nothing to say. Her power was gone. Just when I thought things couldn't get better, Christmas rolled around. Now, our neighborhood was usually pretty festive. Most people put up a few lights, maybe an inflatable snowman here or there. But this year? Oh, this year was different. After years of Karen nitpicking every little thing, the neighborhood had decided to do one big final middle finger to her reign. Everyone went all out. And I mean all out. I'm talking massive blow-up Santas. Flashing neon reindeer. A synchronized light show on someone's roof that played music all night. It was glorious. And Karen lost her mind. She stormed up and down the street, fuming. Filing complaints that no one read. Ranting about decorations being too gaudy, and how we were ruining the integrity of the neighborhood. But the best part? The HOA did nothing. Even better, Karen's house was the only one completely undecorated. It looked so out of place in the middle of a neighborhood that had turned into a Christmas carnival. Tom, my neighbor, grinned as we admired the view. "She's fuming," he said, barely hiding his laughter. "She's lucky," I replied. I was this close to renting a 20-foot inflatable Grinch just for her. We both cracked up. Karen, meanwhile, sat in her dark, undecorated house, watching helplessly as the entire neighborhood celebrated. Without her duppy by the time the new year rolled around, Karen had finally had enough. I noticed the for sale sign in front of her house one morning while taking out the trash. I blinked. I had to see it to believe it. Tom walked up, shaking his head in amazement. "She's really doing it, huh?" "I guess so," I said, staring at the sign. After all that, she's finally giving up. A part of me almost felt bad. Almost. But then I remembered all the harassment, the fake violations, the time she literally called the police on me for owning my own land. Nope. Not even a little bit of guilt. She packed up and left within the month. The day the moving trucks arrived, the entire neighborhood celebrated. Someone even threw a Karen's Gone barbecue in their backyard, complete with party hats and balloons. And just like that, she was gone. No more ridiculous violations. No more clipboard patrols. No more endless HOA drama. The months after Karen left were the most peaceful this neighborhood had ever been. No more petty fights. No more HOA power struggles. No more ridiculous fines for the crime of existing. For the first time in years, people actually enjoyed living here. And my land? Still mine. Still untouched. Still exactly the way I wanted it to be. One day, Tom and I sat on my porch, watching as the new homeowners moved into Karen's old house. "They seem nice," Tom said, sipping his drink. I nodded. "I heard they don't believe in HOAs." We clinked glasses, grinning. Peace at last. And most importantly, no more Karen. A few months had passed since Karen's dramatic departure, and the neighborhood had never been better. The air seemed lighter, the grass greener, and the general mood of the residents had improved dramatically. It was almost like a dark cloud had finally lifted, leaving behind a Karen-free paradise. The new homeowners who moved into her old house were a breath of fresh air. A young couple, easygoing, absolutely uninterested in HOA drama. At the neighborhood's first Karen-free HOA meeting, the biggest discussion wasn't about violations, but about where to host the next block party. No one was walking around with clipboards of doom. No one was measuring grass with a ruler. No one was calling the cops over nonsense. For the first time since I moved in, people actually smiled at each other instead of trading passive-aggressive glares that I kept my land exactly as it was, untouched, peaceful mine. Occasionally, I'd catch a neighbor walking past it and sighing in relief that Karen was no longer trying to pave it over for a community project no one wanted. The only difference? I put up a new sign. Private property, no trespassing, especially if your name is Karen. Just a little inside joke for those who had lived through the reign of terror. Tom nearly choked on his beer when he saw it. "You're a menace." "I learned from the best," I said, smirking. A few weeks after she left, someone, and I swear it wasn't me, left a small garden gnome in front of Karen's old house. It had a tiny little clipboard. The new homeowners thought it was hilarious and decided to keep it there. Just a little memorial to the chaos that once was. One last bit of karma. Every now and then, curiosity got the better of me, and I'd check Karen's new address. Turns out, she had moved into a non-HOA neighborhood. Irony at its finest. Maybe she finally realized that her HOA tyranny days were over. Or maybe, just maybe, she was now experiencing what it was like to be on the receiving end of a truly free neighborhood. Either way, not my problem anymore. Sitting on my porch one evening, I watched as the neighbors gathered outside, laughing, talking, just enjoying life. No one was arguing over mailbox colors. No one was sending passive-aggressive letters. And best of all, no one was patrolling the streets like a suburban dictator. Karen was gone. The grass grew freely. The mailboxes stood proudly in various shades of beige. And we all lived happily ever after. If you could leave one message on a sign for an HOA Karen, what would it say? What's the best way to outsmart an entitled neighbor without breaking any rules? Have you ever fought back against an HOA or a pushy neighbor? How did it go? Would you ever buy a house in an HOA neighborhood after hearing this story? What's your favorite moment of karma from this story?